By the second mile on the Bristol road, the sleet had worked through Charlotte Ivanov's mantle and down to her stays, so that each breath stung and each step landed with the dull ache of soaked leather against skin already rubbed raw. She kept one hand on the rail of the hired carriage as it rolled over ruts and puddled stone, not to steady herself so much as to prove she had not fallen behind. Lady Agatha Ivanov preferred her visible. It was a particular kind of cruelty, measured and social, easier to defend than a blow. The carriage lamps threw weak circles over churned mud. Within those circles Charlotte's shoes darkened, then glistened, then surrendered entirely. Water pressed through seams and settled cold between her toes. The maid inside, pale gloves folded in her lap, glanced once through the fogged glass and then turned her head to the opposite window with practised indifference. Charlotte did not knock. She had knocked once, in November, when wind had split the skin across her knuckles and she had bled on to Lady Agatha's shawl basket. She had been told companions who complained could walk home in all weather and count themselves fortunate. So she walked now in silence while carts overtook them and two gentlemen on horseback passed at an easy pace, their laughter carried backward on the wind. One looked at her dress, then at the crest on the carriage door, and looked away quickly, as if decency required not seeing what rank permitted. At the toll gate the queue stalled. Wheels locked in mud. Drovers cursed under their breath and stamped their boots for warmth. Charlotte stood at the carriage step, while Lady Agatha's coin purse was handed out and handed back, her fingers so cold she could not at first close them around the leather. A boy no older than 12, cheeks red from weather, stared openly at the frayed edge of her cuff where the lining showed through. His mother pulled him closer, then gave Charlotte the brief, assessing look women gave to governesses and poor relations, pity without invitation. Charlotte kept her chin level. Her dark hair, damp and heavy, had escaped its pins and clung to her cheeks in narrow strands. She could feel the skin tightening beneath the wet. Hunger had begun as a hollow before dawn, and sharpened by morning into a narrow twist under her ribs that made her shoulders draw inward, as if guarding something. Her breakfast had been the heel of yesterday's bread, taken standing in the still room while coals were lit for others. She had chewed slowly to make it last. It had not lasted. When the gate finally lifted and the line jolted forward, Lady Agatha's maid opened the carriage door just wide enough to push out a wrapped parcel and said, without meeting Charlotte's eyes, "Her ladyship's gloves require mending before we arrive." Charlotte took the parcel with hands that trembled from cold, not emotion, and tucked it under her mantle as she resumed her place by the wheel. Needlework in sleet was an exercise in absurdity, but absurdity had long ago ceased to surprise her. By the time the assembly rooms came into view, their bright upper windows blazing against a bruised evening sky, her hem was heavy, as if weighted with lead. Carriages crowded the sweep before the entrance. Footmen shouted numbers. Horses snorted steam. Chandeliers burned behind tall panes, and threw warm gold across polished floors she would cross only in passing. Lady Agatha descended first in violet silk that whispered at each step, rose water rising from her sleeves as tangibly as heat from a fire. Her daughters followed in pale satin and seed pearls, faces bright with anticipation and the practised innocence of women who had never gone hungry through an afternoon. Charlotte handed down cloaks, reticules, fan cases, and the packet of account slips Lady Agatha insisted she carry, then moved toward the front steps, out of habit, before a gloved hand blocked her path. "Servants' side," the porter said, not unkindly, merely certain. She nodded once and walked around the building to the narrow door near the kitchens, where the stone was slick and unlit and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. Inside, heat struck her too fast and brought pins of pain to her fingers. She did not pause to warm them. A scullery maid she did not know pointed toward a side table already piled high with wraps, dripping capes, and calling cards to be sorted by household and rank. Charlotte removed her mantle, wrung water from the edge discreetly into a drain, and began. Names blurred at first as she copied them into Lady Agatha's ledger book. Viscount and Lady Ferrers, Mr. and Mrs. Blenheim, Colonel Davies, and party of 3. Ink feathered where drops from her sleeve struck the page. She blotted each mark with care. Upstairs, the first strains of a violin drifted through the floorboards. Applause followed. Someone laughed, clear and careless, the sound of a room that had never had to account for candle costs. An hour passed in errands that had no beginning and no conclusion. Charlotte carried shawls to retiring rooms and returned with empty glove boxes. She climbed back stairs with tray after tray of ratafia, negus, and pastries she was never offered, the scent of butter and sugar so rich it turned her hunger sharp enough to feel like illness. Twice she was sent to retrieve misplaced invitations from carriage compartments in sleet that had become rain. The second time water ran down the back of her neck and along her spine, cold as poured metal. She returned through the servants' corridor and found Lady Agatha waiting near the side of the great ballroom, one hand on her daughter's elbow, smile fixed for spectators. "You are late," she said softly, though Charlotte had been gone fewer than 10 minutes. "Do not drip on the parquet. Stand behind me and hold this tray. Speak only if spoken to. Better still, not then." Charlotte took the silver tray. Its weight settled into her wrists and stayed there. The ballroom heat was heavy with beeswax, perfume, and crowded fabric. Candles multiplied in mirrors until light seemed endless, while at floor level Charlotte could see only the hemline world. Silk sweeping, polished boots turning, the occasional frayed edge concealed quickly when someone noticed her looking. Her stomach cramped once hard enough that she shifted her stance to keep the tray steady. No one remarked upon it. A lady in emerald asked for lemonade without turning her head. A gentleman set an empty glass down with 2 fingers and continued speaking about rents and hunting rights as if she were a table rather than a person. Charlotte moved when signalled, stopped when blocked, and made herself small in the spaces between larger lives. Near 11, when dancing gave way to cards and clustered conversation, Lady Agatha drew close to a knot of titled guests in the antechamber where Charlotte had been placed with more trays. Her tone grew brighter there, sharpened by calculation. "My late husband's daughter," she said, in answer to a question Charlotte did not hear. "Poor child, penniless, I am afraid, entirely dependent, no dowry, no settlement, and no prospects worth naming. We keep her from duty, naturally, but one cannot invent fortune where none exists." Soft laughter followed, not cruel in sound, which made it worse. One of the gentlemen murmured that charity began at home. Another observed that pretty faces were of little use without funds. This was met with a rustle of assent from women whose jewels caught candlelight like ice. Charlotte stood 3 paces behind Lady Agatha with the tray balanced at waist height and kept her breathing even. She did not lower her eyes. She did not challenge the lie. Defiance without proof would cost the attic room the hidden book beneath the mattress ticking, and the narrow margin by which she had thus far remained under a roof connected to her own name. Her fingers, chapped from lie and needlework, tightened under the silver rim until the ache steadied her. Across the corridor a footman brushed past with fresh cards, never looking at her face. In the ballroom beyond, the musicians began another set, brisk and triumphant. Charlotte turned when called, offered glasses to women who had just listened to her erasure, and moved through the candlelit crowd with wet shoes, empty stomach, and the composed silence of a woman taught that surviving the hour was its own form of labour. When the tray was finally light enough to carry one-handed, Charlotte shifted into the narrow strip of wall between two marble columns and let her shoulder touch stone that still held the day's cold, because the ache in her arms had begun to tremble, and she would not allow the glasses to rattle. Lady Agatha's laughter carried above the strings. It rose and fell with the certainty of a woman who had never once paid for cruelty. Charlotte could still hear the phrase "penniless," cleanly spoken, polished for company, and she felt it land where hunger had already hollowed her. It was an old blow. It had only found a new audience. Her father's voice returned against her will, not in words at first, but in the soft scrape of his chair in the library at Ivanhoe House, the room with the west window and the cracked green shade where dust turned gold at dusk. He had signed papers there through one wet autumn, while creditors sent men in good coats and patient boots to stand in the hall. Temporary strain, he had called it. A shipping delay. A bridge loan against spring rents. He had pressed his signet into wax with a hand that shook only when he thought no one watched. Charlotte had watched. She had been 19 then, still in mourning black for her mother, still sleeping in the south chamber with the painted cornice and the wardrobe carved with climbing roses. Fever had taken her mother in 5 days and left the house too quiet to breathe in. Her father had lasted 2 more years, growing thinner at table while he said he was merely tired, merely overworked, merely waiting for one good season to set matters right. After the funeral, it had taken Lady Agatha less than a month to move her trunks in from Bath. She came in violet silk then too, and lavender water, and a tone of practical grief that convinced clergymen and stewards alike. She had been Charlotte's aunt all her life. She knew where every family paper was kept. She knew which servants had loyalty and which had children to feed. She knew precisely how to stand in a doorway and call theft prudence. By the 2nd week, she had the keys. By the 3rd, she had the account books. By Christmas, she had married the widower she called Fragile, and persuaded him to settle administration of Charlotte's inheritance in her hands for protection until the girl reached a more suitable age. Suitable was a moving border. It moved each time Charlotte approached it. Then he died in February, and the border moved again. The will was read in the morning room with frost thick on the panes. Charlotte remembered the legal clerk avoiding her eyes as he recited clauses that sounded correct and final, and left her with an allowance so small it could not buy winter coal for 2 rooms. The trust itself, Lady Agatha said, was tied up by debt obligations and would yield nothing for years. The statement arrived with folded hands and a look of burdened patience, as if Charlotte were the one placing strain on the household by continuing to exist. She had believed part of it then. Grief makes liars sound like physicians. Only later, when unpaid bills vanished and new gowns appeared and the carriage horses were replaced with younger stock, did the arithmetic begin to burn. It never burned in public. In public, Lady Agatha spoke of sacrifice. In public, Charlotte stood behind her with a tray. A knot of young men crossed in front of Charlotte, boot heels bright with ballroom wax, and she stepped back to let them pass, lowering her gaze to avoid the small cruelty of recognition in strangers' eyes. In the mirrored panels, she caught her reflection in fragments. A narrow face gone paler with cold dark hair smoothed back too quickly, sleeves damp to the elbow, one cuff resewn where lace had failed. Plain, they called her, and sometimes she had almost thanked them for the word, because plain women were left alone. Yet plain had not protected her chamber, her books, or her name. Her 2 stepsisters, Imogen and Claire, had taken the south chamber first, then the dressing room beside it, then the cedar chest her mother had lined with blue paper from London. They had done it with shrugs and laughter and the endless logic of preference. You are in mourning still. You do not attend enough calls to need space. You are not out in society now. Later, when she asked for her mother's pearl comb, Imogen turned it in her fingers and said she had no recollection of ever seeing it. Claire wore Charlotte's winter mantle to church one Sunday and returned it with ink at the hem, then complained the fit across the shoulders was poor and she could not imagine how Charlotte had endured it. Endure had become the household verb that applied only to one person. Charlotte endured altered meal hours that left her with crusts after guests had eaten. She bore mending bills for gowns she would never wear, bent over candle ends in an attic room where the roof leaked in steady weather and dripped in storms. Charlotte endured Lady Agatha's habit of summoning her halfway through any mouthful so that she learned to swallow quickly and never with pleasure. By the second week of November she had started hiding half a heel of bread in the pocket sewn into her work apron, not from greed, but from arithmetic. A woman fainting in a corridor was troublesome, and trouble was always priced and charged back to her. The servants saw. Mrs. Davies in the kitchen kept her silence, and once slid a bruised apple towards Charlotte when no one watched, then looked away as if even kindness might be counted against them both. Old Mr. Finch, who had served her grandfather, began setting broken chair legs near the attic stair so she could feed her little grate without asking for coal. No one spoke openly. Lady Agatha did not need open speech. She had refinements for every rank. In drawing-rooms she called Charlotte dear girl and placed her at distances that looked accidental and were exact. At church she pressed 2 coins into the poor box and sighed over household burdens where others could hear. At home she inspected Charlotte's hands for idleness and found fault in cracked skin, in uneven stitches, in thread wasted on seams no one would ever examine but her. Once, when Charlotte answered too quickly that a figure in the linen account could not be correct, Lady Agatha struck her across the cheek with a folded fan in front of a visiting cousin, then smiled and called it affectionate discipline. The cousin laughed because she wanted an invitation to the spring musicale. Charlotte apologised because apology cost less than shelter. She had learned the shape of that bargain so thoroughly she could have drawn it blind. A woman in amber silk paused before Charlotte now and took a glass without thanks, and the gesture pulled another memory loose. This one edged not with grief, but with a quieter humiliation that had never stopped bleeding. Her father had taught her figures and French verbs at the long table in the schoolroom when she was small, not because girls required either for marriage, but because, as he said, a mind was a possession no executor could seize. She had believed him. She still kept one possession in proof, a narrow volume of poems, calfskin cracked, hidden beneath the ticking of her attic mattress, where no one bothered to look because no one imagined a starving woman preserving lines of verse. On nights when the house slept and wind moved under the eaves, she read by rushlight until her eyes watered and copied passages into the margin of an old inventory ledger, writing between columns once meant for sugar and lamp oil. It was a private rebellion, small and exact. Lady Agatha had sold the rest of her father's library in 3 lots. Charlotte had watched the carts leave with atlas cases and folios and the black walnut desk where her mother once wrote letters. She had stood in the yard carrying a basket of mending while buyers argued over bindings, and when she asked whether the family Bible might remain, Lady Agatha said devotion did not require ownership. Debt, she said, demanded practical choices. The same week, Imogen received a new spinet. The week after, Claire ordered gloves from London with pearl buttons that snapped under strain and were discarded after 2 evenings. Debt was selective in that house. So was memory. By Easter, acquaintances had begun speaking of Charlotte as if she were already gone, a useful warning passed between mothers with unmarried sons. Unfortunate birth, no means, delicate constitution perhaps, suited to companion work if she was grateful. Grateful for what? Charlotte had wanted to ask. For a roof that leaked over her bed, for a family table where her chair was removed when guests came and restored when plates were cold, for hearing her own name used as synonym for caution. She did not ask. She carried, copied, stitched, accounted, and waited in the narrow legal shadow between girlhood and dispossession, knowing only that Lady Agatha feared paper more than shame. That fear had shown itself in locked drawers, in ledgers moved at midnight, in the swift tightening around her mouth whenever Charlotte mentioned her father's seal. The signet had disappeared the week he died. So had 2 dispatch boxes and the duplicate rent roll. Charlotte had noticed because she had packed his study herself while everyone else arranged lilies and condolences. She had said nothing then because grief had hollowed language. She had said nothing later because accusation without document was another way to be cast out. Now, with candle heat on one side of her face and winter damp still clinging to the other, she held the tray steady and listened to Lady Agatha tell polished lies in a room bright enough to blind. And beneath the weight of hunger and memory she felt, not despair, but a hard, narrow line of resolve she did not yet dare name, the same line that kept her back straight while strangers discussed her ruin as if it were weather. Resolve was still tightening in her chest when a gloved hand appeared at her elbow, and a folded square of paper was pressed into her palm so quickly that she did not at first see the face attached to it. A footman's livery, not one of Lady Agatha's. Blue braid at the cuff, rain speckled at the shoulder. He had already moved on by the time she turned, slipping between card tables and gilt chairs with the smooth anonymity of paid service. Charlotte set down the tray on a side console, tucked herself into the shadow cast by a tall fern, and broke the wafer seal with a thumbnail gone white from cold. The script was hurried, the ink blotted at one edge as if written standing. "Come to the North Arcade at once. Your father's ledger is in danger. No signature, no crest, no hand she knew." The words struck like a draught through wet linen. Her father's ledger. Not rent rolls, not correspondence, not any vague mention of papers. The ledger. The one volume she had never stopped hunting in quiet ways, through old inventories, through discarded wrapping, through the expressions servants failed to hide when certain drawers were mentioned. She read the line again, then once more counting strokes, searching for disguised letters, for the rounded forms of Claire's mockery or the rigid upright of Lady Agatha's copyist. Nothing settled. The violin line changed in the ballroom beyond the doorway, quick and bright. People laughed. A man called for more punch. In that brightness the note looked indecent, like grief laid on polished wood. Charlotte folded it into her cuff and lifted the tray again, because anyone watching would notice absence sooner than movement, and carried 2 empty glasses toward the service passage with deliberate calm, while her pulse knocked hard at the base of her throat. Near midnight the halls took on a second life, one less orderly than the first. Guests drifted where they should not. Footmen traded routes to keep pace with sudden requests. Doors that had stood closed now opened and shut with damp draughts and hurried whispers. Charlotte set the glasses with the wash crew, collected a fresh napkin to justify her errand, and took the east corridor first, then cut behind the music room toward the north wing where the stone turned colder and the candles farther apart. She did not run. Wet shoes betrayed haste on parquet. At the last turn, a burst of laughter spilled from a smoking room, and 2 gentlemen stepped out with cigars, forcing her to flatten against the wall, with her head bent so they would register only a servant passing. One of them smelled of clove and brandy, the other of rain and horse. They moved on. She reached the north arcade door and slipped through into air that felt like metal on her teeth. The arcade ran along the outer wall, roofed but open in arches to the dark gardens, where sleet had thinned to needling rain that struck gravel in a constant hiss. Lanterns hung at intervals. Half of them had burned low. Between them lay pockets of shadow broken by the pale flare of winter sky. The place was not empty. A couple crossed at the far end in murmured argument. A servant hurried past with blankets over one arm, eyes lowered. Somewhere beyond the arches a groom cursed softly at a balking horse. Charlotte took 2 steps and heard it then, not loud, a dull impact followed by the scrape of leather against stone. She turned toward the 3rd arch and saw a tall figure braced one hand against a pillar, shoulders rigid beneath a greatcoat dark with rain, head bent as if refusing to fall. Water ran from the brim of his hat. When he lifted his face, lantern light caught a jaw set hard enough to change the shape of it, and eyes the colour of storm water, fixed directly on her with a command already formed. "Do not call out! Bandage this!" The words came low and clipped. Not plea, not courtesy. Instruction issued by a man accustomed to being obeyed in one breath. He pulled off a glove with his teeth, pressed it to his left side for 1 second, then lifted his hand away. Dark wet had spread through coat and waistcoat below the ribs. Not fresh blood in a bright spill, but reopened seep from strain, rain-thinned and dangerous all the same in this cold. Charlotte's first instinct was to look for witnesses. 2 arches down, the couple had vanished through a side door. At the near end, no one. The lantern nearest them hissed in the draught. She stepped closer before caution finished speaking. Hunger, humiliation, and fear had trained her in costs, not in refusal, when pain stood before her in human form. "My lord," she said, because rank arrived a beat after recognition, and nearly stopped her hands. "Lord Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Harrow Vale." She had seen him only at distance before this evening, a dark figure near the card-room fire, while men shifted to make space without being asked. His title moved through rooms ahead of him. War service, a cavalry wound at Vittoria that never fully healed. A household run with military precision and silence. No wife, no toleration for fools. And now that same man stood in the unheated arcade with one hand white around a stone column and gave orders to a woman his world would call negligible. "Bandage!" he repeated. Charlotte set the napkin and tray on the ledge beneath an arch and stripped off her gloves with fingers that shook once and then steadied. "I have no lint here." "You have linen." His gaze dropped to her cuff. "Use it." She did not argue. She tore a strip from the inner edge of her petticoat, where the seam had already frayed, and folded it twice. "Hold still." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "I am standing, Miss Ivanoff." Her name in his voice sent a cleaner fear through her than the rain. He knew exactly who she was. Of course he did. He had been in the antechamber when Lady Agatha made a spectacle of her poverty. He had heard and followed and chosen this moment. She opened his coat. Beneath, his waistcoat was soaked through along an old scar line, puckered and pale, where new strain had split skin in 2 narrow places. No blade wound tonight. Overexertion. Too much movement in cold weather. She pressed the folded linen firm and felt him go, utterly still, not flinching, not speaking. His breath left once through his nose and fogged in the air between them. "This will need stitching if it opens farther," she said. "It will not." "That is not medicine, Your Grace." "It is instruction." She tied the strip around him, pulled the knot flat, then reached for his coat to close it against the wind. He caught her wrist, not hard, only enough to halt the motion, and looked down at her hand as if reading a ledger page. "Who struck you?" She followed his gaze, a yellowed mark, old, near the inside of her sleeve where fabric had shifted. She turned her wrist free. "No one tonight." "Liar." The word was quiet, more precise than loudness. "You are starving. Your hem is mended 7 times. You have bruises in the shape of fingers. She means to erase you." Rain rattled along the roof slates. Charlotte folded the remaining linen and tucked it away to hide the movement of her hands. "You mistake household disorder for drama, Your Grace." He looked at her as if the answer had disappointed him on a strategic level. "I do not mistake patterns." A burst of voices rose from the inner corridor. 2 ladies in wraps drifted into view at the far end of the arcade with a maid carrying warmed bricks. Charlotte stepped back at once and lowered her head. The Duke shifted half a pace, broad enough to block direct line of sight without drawing attention. The ladies passed within 10 feet, speaking of dance partners and the damp weather, never once glancing at the shadowed arch where a duke stood with a poor relation and did not move. When they were gone, the silence returned with the hiss of rain. "You sent the note," Charlotte said. "Yes." "Why use my father's name?" "Because you would come." Truth, brutal and clean. She could not fault it. She could resent it. "You had no right." "No." He adjusted his glove over the bandaged side with controlled slowness. "I had urgency." "Concerning what?" "You." The single word struck harder than the cold had. Charlotte felt heat rise despite the night air and despised the involuntary response. "I am not a matter of stain." "You are a matter of theft." He reached into his inner coat and drew out a folded paper protected in oilskin, then held it where lantern light could touch the crest impressed at the corner. Not hers, not Ivanov. A notary's office mark from Bath. He did not offer it yet. "I heard Lady Agatha announce you penniless," he said. "Too polished, too ready. She needed the room to hear it. That indicates preemption." She stared at the seal. "Preemption of what?" "Any offer, any inquiry, any man with counsel enough to examine your settlements." His eyes lifted back to hers. "Who benefits if every house in this county believes you without portion?" The answer sat between them with the weight of iron. "You investigate strangers' finances at assemblies?" she asked. "I investigate fraud when it is performed in public." "You do not know there is fraud." "I know fear when I see it." He tucked the oilskin away again. "She watches papers, not people. She tightened when your father's accounts were mentioned by the Ferrers man. She redirected him in 3 sentences. She failed to notice you listening." Charlotte held her breath for 1 count. 2. "What do you want from me?" "Facts." "You already have opinions." His gaze hardened, then steadied. "Good. Give me facts that survive scrutiny." She looked past him, through the nearest arch where rain silvered the gravel and the dark yew hedge beyond. If this was a trap, it was expertly built. If it was not, refusing him might leave her exactly where Lady Agatha required, discredited, isolated, and still without documents. The choice was not between danger and safety. It was between known ruin and uncertain leverage. "My father kept 3 principal books," she said at last. "Household expense, tenant rents, and private loan obligations. The private ledger was bound in black calf with a brass corner repaired on the lower right. He locked it in the West Library desk each night." "And now, gone the week he died, so were his signet and 2 dispatch boxes." "Witnesses. Only servants paid to forget." He gave one short nod, as if a piece on an internal board had moved into place. "Did he ever mention a duplicate?" She hesitated. This was the edge she had guarded for 2 years, the one fragment she had never spoken aloud, because once spoken it could be stolen, denied, mocked into dust. "He said once," she answered, each word chosen, "that no gentleman who expected illness trusted one ink trail. He told me there was always a mirror record where greedy hands would not think to look." "Where?" "He did not say." She met his eyes. "He meant to tell me after Michaelmas. He died in February." For the first time since she entered the arcade, something shifted across the Duke's face that was not command, not softness. Recognition of loss, perhaps, sharp and quickly buried. "Then we begin with what can be proven now," he said. "You will return inside. You will behave as if we discussed weather. You are giving orders again?" "Yes." "I am not in your household, Your Grace." "No, you are in a field of hostile witnesses." He stepped closer, voice dropping so low she had to lean to hear. "Listen carefully. The note that brought you here can be turned against you by Dawn. If she learns you met me alone, she will call it ambition. If she controls the narrative first, magistrates will hear scandal before evidence." The truth of it tightened every muscle in Charlotte's back. "What do you propose?" "Stay in sight of me in public rooms. Speak to no one alone, not even known servants, until I confirm which are bought. If handed paper, show me first. If summoned privately by Lady Agatha, refuse on grounds of faintness, illness, any pretext. Buy time. You expect obedience from a stranger because you carry a title. I expect survival from a woman who has done it without help." The words landed where his earlier command had not. She looked at him then, fully, at rain caught along the line of his hair, at the controlled tension around his mouth, at the hand near his side held a fraction too rigid to avoid reopening the wound she had bound. He was dangerous in all the ways power always was. He was also the first person in 2 years to name her circumstances without euphemism. From the corridor door came the scrape of a latch and hurried steps. A footman's voice called, "Your Grace, they are looking for you in the card salon." Julian Ashcombe did not glance away from Charlotte when he answered, "Tell them I am coming." The steps retreated. He took 1 pace back, restoring distance the world would recognise, and his expression closed like a gate. "We return now." Charlotte picked up the tray and napkin. Her fingers had gone cold again. "And if Lady Agatha asks where I have been, tell her the truth in the smallest possible shape." His eyes flicked to the bandage beneath his coat, then back to her face. "You carried linen to the North Arcade." He turned toward the corridor, then stopped once more without facing her. "Miss Ivanoff." "Yes, Your Grace." "Stay in sight of me. Speak to no one alone." Charlotte inclined her head as if the command were nothing more than courtesy, then followed him through the corridor door with the tray balanced against her hip and rain still cooling the torn edge of her petticoat beneath her skirts. The air changed at once, heat, beeswax, orange peel in the punch, too many bodies inside too much silk. She kept 3 paces behind him until the card salon opened and rank reclaimed its visible geometry. Men bowing, chairs shifting, a space clearing without a single word from the Duke of Harrow Vale. He did not look back. He did not need to. Charlotte moved to the sideboard and resumed the shape expected of her. Silent hands, lowered gaze, precise steps that made service appear effortless, while fear worked under her ribs like a second pulse. Lady Agatha found her within minutes. Violet Silk whispered before she spoke. "Where were you?" Charlotte set down a stack of empty saucers. "In the North Arcade, my lady. A gentleman required linen." "Which gentleman?" "A gentleman in need of linen, my lady." Lady Agatha's smile did not alter, though the skin beside her mouth tightened by a fraction. "Do not become clever, Charlotte. Clever women without prospects are mistaken for desperate ones." "Yes, my lady." She was sent at once to the retiring room, then to the cloak table, then back again, errands without purpose except surveillance. Charlotte obeyed each command and kept the Duke within her line of sight whenever corridors opened. At the card table he sat rigid, dark head, bent over a spread of whist cards he seemed not to see. At supper he stood near the mantel with 2 colonels and spoke in clipped intervals. Once, as she passed with warmed wine, his gaze touched the frayed cuff at her wrist and moved on, giving no sign that they had stood inches apart in the rain less than half an hour earlier. By the time the last quadrille ended, the east windows had faded from black to iron grey. Guests began to depart in uneven waves, feathers damped by mist, laughter dulled by fatigue. Charlotte carried cloaks down the side stair and checked names against Lady Agatha's list, while footmen shouted carriage numbers into the courtyard wind. Her stomach had stopped twisting and gone to a flatter, emptier ache. She had not eaten since dawn. When she steadied herself against the wall, she told her body it could wait. Imogen descended in a cloud of pale satin and irritation. "Charlotte, my mantle!" "Not that one, the French wool. Truly, if one must keep poor relations, one might at least keep competent ones." Claire followed, yawning behind a gloved hand. "Mamma, she looks feverish. How dramatic!" Lady Agatha accepted her own cloak from Charlotte without thanks, then leaned close enough for rose-water to sting Charlotte's throat. "You will return to the house with the first trunk cart. I shall ride later. The north storeroom inventory must be copied before noon." Charlotte bowed. "Yes, my lady." No mention of sleep, no mention of food. Only lists and keys and the household arithmetic of punishment disguised as routine. Rain had thinned to a wet mist when the service cart jolted through the side gate of Ivanov House. The sky held the pale, exhausted light of early winter morning. Charlotte climbed down with 2 hat boxes and a bundle of damp wraps, her shoes slipping on stone darkened by night rain. The house loomed, as it always did after public rooms, too large and too cold, its blank windows giving nothing back. Inside the service hall, scullery girls moved slowly with pails and ash buckets, faces pinched from broken sleep. Mrs. Davies stood at the kitchen table trimming bruised pears for preserves and looked up once, taking in Charlotte's wet hem, hollow eyes, and bare hands without gloves. "There is tea on the hob," she said quietly. Charlotte swallowed. "Lady Agatha ordered the north inventory before noon." Mrs. Davies set down her knife. "Then take this first." She slid half a heel of bread across the table. Charlotte took it and ate in 3 careful bites, not from greed, but from urgency. The bread was stale. It tasted like rescue. She had just reached the passage to the north storeroom when a sharp, metallic clang split the quiet from the direction of the coach-yard, followed by a muffled cough and one hoarse curse cut short. Charlotte paused with the inventory ledger in her arms. Another sound came, not metal this time, a human sound dragged thin by fever. A groom crossed behind her carrying harness oil. She turned to him. "Who is in the coach house?" He kept walking. "No one of consequence." She stepped into his path. "Who?" His eyes flicked toward the back stairs, then away. "Elias." The name struck memory. Elias Pike, one of the newer stable hands, 19 at most, narrow-shouldered, always polite, with a burn scar along his left wrist from a lantern spill last spring. "Why is he locked in?" The groom's jaw hardened. "Lady Agatha said he stole oat mash. She said he may consider his conduct until she decides wages. We were told to leave him." "Since when?" "Last evening." Charlotte's grip tightened on the ledger. "He has been shut in all night." The groom shifted his weight, ashamed and defensive at once. "Orders are orders, miss." Orders were always orders when the pain belonged to someone lower. She set the ledger on a side chest and walked to the rear yard without another word. Mist beaded her hair. Coal smoke and wet hay thickened the air as she crossed the cobbles to the coach-house door. A heavy latch had been dropped through the outer staple and fixed with an iron pin. From inside came a low thud, then a ragged breath. "Elias!" she called through the wood. A pause. "Miss Ivanov," the answer broke in the middle. "I am sorry. I did not take coin, I only took Machar. For old Brindle, he would not eat dry feed." Brindle, the oldest carriage horse in the stable, ribs visible through winter coat. Charlotte shut her eyes for one heartbeat. "Can you stand?" "Not well," his voice wavered. Fever, then, likely from the damp and no fire. She looked back toward the yard. 2 stablemen were pretending to busy themselves with traces, both watching, both prepared to deny having seen anything. "Bring me a coal shovel," she said. No one moved. Charlotte crossed the yard, took the shovel herself from beside the ash barrel, and returned to the door. The iron pin had rusted into place. She wedged the shovel tip under the loop and put her weight on the handle. The first push slipped. The second shrieked metal against metal. On the third, the staple tore half free from old wood, and the latch dropped with a crash that echoed against stone. She pulled the door open. The coach house smelled of mildew, horse sweat, and stale damp. Elias sat against a wheel hub on a pile of old sacking, coat soaked through, skin flushed high at the cheekbones and grey around the mouth. His hand shook visibly when he tried to push himself upright. "Do not stand," Charlotte said, already kneeling. She pressed her palm to his brow. Heat, too much. "How long have you had chills?" "Since yesterday afternoon, miss. I thought it would pass." It had not passed. It had climbed. She rose and turned to the doorway. "Thomas, water, clean bucket, now." One of the stablemen flinched at being named. "If her ladyship learns, she will learn I gave an order to save a worker she pays. Move!" He ran. Charlotte stripped off her outer shawl and folded it under Elias's shoulders to lift him away from the stone floor. She tore another strip from her petticoat hem, soaked it in the first bucket that arrived, and laid it across his neck, then his wrists, then back to his forehead in steady turns. Mrs. Davies appeared at the threshold moments later, breathing hard from the yard crossing, carrying a small crock of willow bark infusion and 2 warmed bricks wrapped in old flannel. "You sent for me?" she asked. "I shouted for water," Charlotte said, not looking up. "Thank you for hearing more than I said." Mrs. Davies set down the crock and knelt on Elias's other side without ceremony. "Raise his head, slow, there. Drink, lad." Elias swallowed, coughed, then swallowed again. His eyes fluttered closed, then opened, unfocused. "I am sorry, miss," he whispered. "I did not mean trouble." Charlotte changed the compress again. "You are ill. Illness is not insolence." Outside, hoofbeats cut across the yard gravel and stopped hard. A carriage door opened. Male voices, low and official, exchanged brief words she could not make out. She did not look. The compress in her hand had warmed. She dipped it again, wrung it, replaced it with precise pressure learned from tending her father through his last winter, when every night had been a calculation between heat and time. 3 days of sleet and no proper rest had left her own limbs trembling, yet her movements stayed exact. Fold, ring, place, wait for breath to ease, repeat. She counted without speaking because rhythm steadied panic. Elias's shivering lessened after several rounds. Colour shifted from fever scarlet toward a more human pink. When he tried to apologise again, she hushed him with one word. "Breathe!" A shadow crossed the threshold, large, still. Charlotte did not turn at once. She knew the shape before she looked. Julian Ashcombe stood just beyond the lintel, coat changed but boots still rain dark, hat in one hand, expression carved to neutrality so complete it bordered on severity. A groom behind him held back as if uncertain whether to enter. The Duke's gaze moved over the room in one sweep, torn latch, dropped iron pin, wet cloths, Mrs. Davies, Elias propped on sacking, Charlotte's skirt ripped at the hem where linen had been sacrificed twice in one night. He said nothing. Charlotte lowered her eyes and returned to the compress. If he had come for ledgers, he had found a different ledger entirely, written in steam and breath, and the choices made when no audience was intended. Shame flickered at the back of her throat anyway, old training asserting itself. She was kneeling on a coach-house floor with her hair coming loose and her hands red with cold. Dukes did not need to see such things. Mrs. Davies, practical as stone, gave him a brief curtsy from where she knelt. "Your Grace," he inclined his head. "How long has he been confined?" Mrs. Davies hesitated. Charlotte answered first. "Since last evening." The Duke's jaw tightened once. "Who ordered it?" Silence dragged for 2 beats. A third. "Lady Agatha Ivanov," Charlotte said. His attention shifted to her face. No softness, no visible anger. Only that intense, measuring stillness she had begun to recognise as the moment he stored a fact for later use. "Will he recover?" he asked. "If his fever breaks and he is kept warm," Charlotte said. "If he is not punished for being ill." Elias stirred and tried to rise when he heard the title. Julian lifted one hand without looking at him. "Stay down." The stable hand obeyed at once, more from tone than sense. Julian stepped inside then, careful of the bucket, and set his hat on an upturned crate, as if he meant to remain. He removed his gloves finger by finger and turned to the groom at the door. "Send for Dr. Hallam. Immediate attendance. My account." The groom bolted. Another order followed, as flat and unarguable as a blade laid on a table. "Light the brazier. Bring dry blankets. If anyone repeats Lady Agatha's instruction in this yard, that man will answer to me before noon." Boots scattered over cobbles. Action replaced paralysis. One stableman dragged in coal. Another carried folded horse rugs and looked vaguely ill with relief at being told to disobey cruelty by higher authority. Charlotte kept working the compress, though her fingers had begun to numb. Julian watched her hands once, then crossed to the water bucket, wrung out a fresh cloth himself, and held it out. She looked up, startled enough to forget rank for a breath. "My hands are cleaner than yours," he said. "Take it." She accepted the cloth and replaced the warmed strip on Elias's brow. Their fingers brushed only briefly. Even through cold, the contact registered as heat along her skin, and was gone. Time thinned into task. The brazier caught. Steam rose. Elias drank 2 more swallows of willow bark and stopped shaking quite so hard. Mrs. Davies tucked hot bricks near his boots and nodded approval when his breathing settled into longer pulls. In the yard beyond, a carriage wheel grated against stone, then rolled away. The house was waking. Upper windows brightened one by one. Julian moved back to the doorway and stood with his shoulders filling the frame, sentinel more than guest. He asked no more questions. He did not intrude upon the care itself. He simply remained, a silent line between the coach-house and whatever consequences would come through the yard once Lady Agatha learned her order had been broken. Charlotte felt the weight of that presence without looking directly at it. She should have been afraid of what this would cost her. She was. She also knew she would break that latch again tomorrow, and the day after, for anyone locked in fever by vanity, and called discipline for it. When at last Elias drifted into a light, easier sleep, Mrs. Davies touched Charlotte's sleeve. "Enough for a moment. Breathe, child." Charlotte sat back on her heels and only then noticed the tremor running through her forearms. She wiped her damp hands on her skirt and rose carefully, knees stiff from cold stone. As she turned, Julian stepped aside to give her room, though the doorway was wide enough for both. From the far passage came the unmistakable rustle of heavy silk, moving quickly, accompanied by the sharp tap of a cane against flagstone, and Claire's bright, breathless voice carrying ahead of it. "Mama, they said she broke the coach-house door." Lady Agatha reached the threshold on that breathless announcement, violet silk sweeping damp straw, rose water cutting through the smell of coal and wet hay like a blade through cloth. Claire hovered at her shoulder with bright eyes and parted lips, eager as if for theatre. 2 footmen halted behind them, uncertain whether to enter. The stablemen lowered their heads at once. Mrs. Davies rose from her knees beside Elias and stepped back 1 pace, hands folded in her apron, face unreadable. Lady Agatha did not look at the boy on the sacking. She looked only at Charlotte. "What have you done?" The question was not a question, it was sentence first, evidence later. Charlotte felt the old reflex rise in her throat, apology offered before accusation had shape, the habit of a house where survival depended on swallowing truth fast. She tasted damp wool and willow bark on the air, and forced the reflex down. "He was locked in with fever, my lady," she said. "He required air and water." Lady Agatha's cane struck the flagstone once. Sharp, final. "He required discipline. You required permission." Julian Ashcombe remained at the doorway, broad shoulders filling the light. He had not moved when Lady Agatha entered. He did not move now, yet the room altered around his stillness. Even Claire fell silent. Lady Agatha turned to him with an expression that sought injured grace, and found it by practice. "Your Grace, you find us in household disorder. I regret that you must witness servant theatrics." His voice was level. "I witnessed a locked door, a fever, and a woman preventing harm." The words landed with no rise in volume, and because there was no rise, no one could pretend not to hear. Lady Agatha gave a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Miss Ivanov is apt to mistake boundaries for cruelty. She has a sentimental disposition. It leads to scenes." Charlotte felt her jaw tighten. Sentimental. The word used for unpaid labour, for hunger, for every refusal to look away from suffering. She kept her gaze on Lady Agatha's shoulder, not her face, because direct eye contact would be called insolence, and charged accordingly. "He has done no crime," Charlotte said. "He fed an old horse." "Silence!" Lady Agatha snapped the word without turning. The cane lifted, not high, only enough for Charlotte to recognise the movement from a dozen corridors and twice as many drawing rooms. Public correction, meant to sting, never to mark. Polite violence. The cane did not fall. Julian's hand closed around it midway, gloved fingers precise, grip unhurried and absolute. He did not wrench it away. He simply held it still between them, his eyes on Lady Agatha's face. "No," he said. 1 syllable, stone flat, irreversible. Claire made a small sound, half gasp, half delight, then swallowed it when her mother's spine stiffened. The stableman stared at the floor with painful intensity. Mrs. Davies did not move at all. Lady Agatha tried to recover the cane with a delicate pull. Julian did not release it. "Your Grace," she said, voice cooling, "you overstep." "I intervene. In my own household." He let that rest for a beat. then released the cane and dropped his hand to his side. "You are correct. Let us discuss household authority in front of a magistrate." Colour shifted under Lady Agatha's powder. Very little. Enough. "This is absurd. A stable hand pilfered feed. A dependent relation broke a locked fixture. I sought order." Julian glanced once toward Elias, whose breathing had steadied into sleep, then back to Lady Agatha. "You sought obedience at the expense of life." "You speak as if I wished the boy dead." "I speak as if you counted him disposable." Charlotte's fingers had begun to tremble again, not from cold this time, but from the pressure of hearing truths spoken aloud that she had carried alone until they had become part of her posture. She curled her hands into her skirts to hide the movement. Julian noticed anyway. His gaze dropped to her knuckles, then to the torn hem where linen strips had been ripped away, then returned to Lady Agatha with a colder focus than before. "She tore her own petticoat twice in 12 hours, he said. "Once to bind my wound, once to cool your servant's fever. Her shoes are still wet from last night. She has been working without rest. You called this theatrics." Lady Agatha's composure thinned. "You have paid unusual attention to Miss Ivanov's clothing." "I pay attention to facts." Claire looked from one to the other with avid confusion. "Mamma, is this about the assembly? Everyone heard you say she has nothing." The cane tip struck stone again, this time at Claire's feet. "Be quiet." By the first hour after dawn, the coachyard had begun to stir with deliveries and stable rounds, but no one crossed the threshold now. Word travelled faster than carts. A duke stood in the Ivanov coach-house, and Lady Agatha's certainty had met resistance in public sight. Dr. Hallam arrived breathless, medical satchel in hand, spectacles fogged from the yard mist. He stopped short at the crowd in the doorway, registered rank in quick sequence, and bowed. "Your Grace, Lady Ivanov." "Attend the boy," Julian said. "Report plainly." The physician knelt by Elias, took pulse, checked pupils, listened to the chest, and accepted Mrs. Davis's brief account with professional nods. He worked quickly and without drama, ordering warm broth, dry linen, and hourly compresses. At last he stood. "He is fevered, but not in immediate danger now," Dr. Hallam said. "If left in cold confinement much longer, outcome would have been grave." The room went very quiet. Lady Agatha drew herself up. "You overstate." Dr. Hallam did not look at her when he answered. "I do not." External authority settled where accusation had floated. Charlotte felt the shift physically, like a door unlatching somewhere inside her chest. Julian spoke without taking his eyes from Lady Agatha. "Your order was to leave him confined?" Lady Agatha's nostrils flared. "My order was temporary restraint. Servants invent details when they fear consequence." "Then you will welcome statements taken under oath?" Claire took a step backward. "Oath! Mamma!" Lady Agatha ignored her daughter and fixed her attention on Charlotte with surgical contempt. "You engineered this. You dragged his Grace into stable filth for spectacle." Charlotte lifted her chin. "He came to the yard before I knew it." "Liar!" Julian's tone did not change, yet the single word cut across Lady Agatha's as cleanly as a snapped thread. "Do not call her that again." Lady Agatha turned fully toward him now, abandoning pretense. "You presume much for a man with no knowledge of family arrangements?" His reply came at once. "I heard your arrangement last night. Penniless, you said. No settlement, no prospects. You announced it to a room of witnesses and looked to see who believed you." A pulse jumped once at Lady Agatha's temple. "You mistake social kindness for conspiracy." "I mistake nothing." Charlotte felt every eye in the coach-house slide toward her, measuring, recalculating. attaching her name to words that had never before been spoken in her defence. Heat rose behind her eyes. She blinked it away at once. She would not weep here, not in straw and damp and rose-water. Lady Agatha shifted tactics with the swiftness of a practised predator. Her voice softened into wounded concern. "Your Grace, whatever unease has reached you, Miss Ivanov is fragile. She forms attachments where prudence is required. I have borne this burden for years with patience. If she has told you tales about ledgers and seals, she grieves still and confuses memory." Charlotte tasted iron where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. This was the familiar method. Call truth illness. Call memory female weakness. Call theft administration. Julian stepped away from the doorway and into the room by a single pace. Not toward Lady Agatha, toward Charlotte. He stopped beside her, close enough that she felt the heat of him through damp wool, far enough to keep propriety intact. He did not touch her. "Miss Ivanov," he said, still looking at Lady Agatha, "did you ask my permission before opening that door?" Charlotte frowned, thrown by the question. "No, Your Grace." "Did you pause to calculate your reputation?" "No." "Why did you do it?" She glanced at Elias on the sacking, then at the broken latch on the floorboards. "Because he was ill." Julian turned then, finally meeting her eyes. In his face she saw no softness at all. She saw respect, hard and unadorned, given like judgment. "Exactly," he said. He faced Lady Agatha again. "That is the woman you call unstable." The words could not be withdrawn. Not after witnesses. Not after physician. Not after servants had heard and would carry them to every corridor by noon. Lady Agatha smiled with her teeth. "And what is she to you, Your Grace, that you defend her so ardently in my own yard?" The question hung with deliberate poison. Claire inhaled sharply. One footman looked as if he wished to vanish into the wall. Julian answered without haste. "A person under my protection in this matter." Lady Agatha gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Protection! How noble! How convenient for a young woman declared without means!" Charlotte felt the insult strike, then dissipate before it could root. Something in her had changed in the last hour, not healed, not safe, but less willing to kneel inside language built to erase her. Julian's voice dropped lower, carrying farther because of it. "Hear me carefully, Lady Ivanov. From this moment, Miss Ivanov is not to be summoned, questioned, punished, or dismissed from this house except in my presence or in the presence of legal counsel. If you breach that, I will proceed publicly and immediately." A stableman dropped a brush in the yard. No one bent to retrieve it. Lady Agatha stared at him, as if weighing whether defiance might still be profitable. "You issue commands in another family's affairs. I issue warning before remedy. You threaten me." "I inform you," Claire whispered. Ma, please," with a tremor that suggested she understood at last the edge beneath social speech. Mrs. Davies moved quietly to Charlotte's side and placed a folded cloth in her hands without comment. The gesture was small. It steadied her more than any speech might have done. Dr. Hallam cleared his throat. "The patient requires quiet, Lady Ivanov. If contention continues, I shall remove him to the surgery." Julian inclined his head once. "Do so. Send your account to Harrow Vale until further notice." Lady Agatha snapped. "There will be no need. My household pays its own." Julian did not even look at her. "My instruction stands." 2 grooms came with a stretcher board and blankets. Under the physician's direction, they lifted Elias carefully. Charlotte stepped forward instinctively to adjust the cloth at his throat. Elias's eyes opened to slits. "Miss," he whispered. "You are safe," she said. He looked past her and saw the Duke, then closed his eyes again. whether from exhaustion or relief, she could not tell. When the stretcher passed through the doorway, the cluster of onlookers parted fast. Yard sounds resumed in uneasy fragments. Bucket handles clanged. A horse stamped. Life, having halted for rank and confrontation, pretended at ordinary motion. Lady Agatha drew herself to full height, cane vertical before her like a staff. "This spectacle is beneath all of us. Charlotte, upstairs, now." Charlotte didn't move. The old fear rose, automatic, tied to years of reflex obedience. Her body knew the cost of delay. Her back remembered blows meant to leave no mark. But another fact stood beside that memory now, broad-shouldered and immovable. Julian spoke before she could decide. "She will eat first." Lady Agatha turned on him. "You presume to direct my—" "She will eat first," he repeated, each word cut clean. "Then she will rest 1 hour. Then she will meet with me and Dr. Hallam in the morning room, with Mrs. Davies present." "That is outrageous!" "That is happening." He shifted just enough to place himself between Lady Agatha and Charlotte, not touching either, a barrier made of posture alone. The movement was so controlled it looked almost formal, as if he were merely allowing passage in a crowded corridor. Charlotte felt the intent all the same, protective, deliberate, public. Lady Agatha's gaze flicked to the footmen, the grooms, Claire, Dr. Hallam, Mrs. Davies, calculating the witness count, the risk of open conflict, the value of retreat. At last she lowered the cane tip and gave one stiff nod that was not consent so much as temporary arithmetic. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. "For now." She turned, silk rustling like dry leaves, and swept from the coach house with Claire hurrying in her wake. The moment she crossed the yard, the tension did not vanish. It thinned, enough for breath. Julian remained where he was until Lady Agatha disappeared through the back passage. Only then did he look at Charlotte fully. Up close, she saw fatigue carved into the lines beside his mouth, and the slight pull at his left side where the bandage beneath his coat still held. "You are shaking," he said. "I am cold." "You are also exhausted." She opened her mouth to deny it. He lifted one hand. "Do not." The command carried no cruelty. It sounded, in that narrow room of straw and coal smoke, like shelter dressed as authority. "Mrs. Davies intervened before Charlotte could answer. "I shall take her to the kitchen, Your Grace." Julian nodded. "Bread, broth, not tea alone." "Yes, Your Grace." Charlotte took one step toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Why?" The question escaped before caution could stop it. Not why intervene in general. Why here? Why her? Why this level of risk for a woman publicly declared useless? Julian held her gaze for a long second. Outside, a wagon rolled over cobbles, the sound dull and steady. "Because I watched you choose mercy when cruelty would have cost you less," he said. "I will not pretend I did not see it." The words struck with the force of a verdict and the gentleness of being believed. He added quieter, "And because you are not alone in this house, again, not while I stand in it." Charlotte could not answer. Her throat closed around language she had not needed for years because no one had asked for it. She gave a small bow instead, the motion unsteady, and went with Mrs. Davies into the cold morning passage, while behind her the Duke of Harrow Vale stayed in the coach-house doorway, motionless as stone, as if leaving first were a form of abandonment he refused to commit. By noon, the kitchen fire had put colour back into Charlotte's hands, but not strength into her knees, and she held the broth bowl with both palms to stop the faint tremor Mrs. Davies pretended not to see. Bread, then broth, then a second slice at the Duke's explicit order. She ate every crumb. The old instinct to leave half for later warred with the fact that later might arrive with witnesses, and no pause for hunger. When she rose, Mrs. Davies pressed a folded handkerchief into her hand and murmured, "Your cuff, miss." Charlotte drew out the note from the north arcade, still damp soft at one corner from rain and body heat, and placed it flat beside the empty bowl as if laying down evidence at an altar. She entered the morning room exactly 1 hour later, as instructed. Julian stood by the cold hearth in a dark coat, newly brushed, left side held with the same careful rigidity she now recognised as pain contained by will. Dr. Hallam waited at the escritoire with a leather case open and spectacles low on his nose. Mrs. Davies took a place near the door, silent and steady. 2 men Charlotte did not know stood beside the window, a magistrate in plain black broadcloth, and a clerk with fresh paper, sand shaker, and 3 sharpened quills. Lady Agatha arrived last in rustling violet silk, Claire 2 steps behind, Imogen pale and offended at being summoned before luncheon. The magistrate bowed to Charlotte first. "Miss Ivanoff, I am Mr. Hales. We are here to take statements concerning unlawful confinement, coercive control of trust assets, and suspected document suppression." Lady Agatha laughed once, thin. "This is grotesque." Mr. Hales did not look at her. "It is lawful." Charlotte placed the folded note on the table. "This was delivered last night by a footman with blue braid at the cuff. It asked me to come to the north arcade and stated my father's ledger was in danger." Julian answered before the magistrate asked, "The messenger was mine. Robert Vale, Harrowvale livery, altered with hired braid for discretion. He is present in the hall and can attest under oath." Lady Agatha turned sharply. "You admit entrapment." "I admit urgency," he said, "not deception in substance." The clerk wrote without lifting his head. Mr. Hales extended a hand for the note, read it, then passed it to the clerk, who marked it Exhibit A in neat black strokes. Dr. Hallam gave his report next, concise and clinical. Fever level on examination, risk from prolonged exposure, improvement after release and treatment, no embellishment, no room for argument. Exhibit B became his signed medical statement. Then Julian removed an oilskin packet from his inner coat and laid it on the desk. Notary abstract from Bath. Filed 4 months after Mr. Ivanoff's death. It references a duplicate register held in custody under instruction to release only if primary household books are disputed. He looked at Charlotte. "You were right about the mirror record." Something tightened in her throat. She nodded once. A knock sounded. Mr. Hales called, "Enter!" The door opened to admit an older notary with travel dust at his hem, hat in hand, and a dispatch box chained to his wrist. He bowed to the room. "Nathaniel Pritchard, Bath Registry Office." His eyes moved to Charlotte with a quick, respectful pause. "Miss Ivanov, your father named you in the sealed memorandum?" Lady Agatha stepped forward. "There is no such memorandum." Mr. Pritchard held up the chain. "There is, madam. The magistrate's order compelled production this morning." The lock clicked. The box opened. Inside lay a black calf ledger with a repaired brass corner on the lower right, exactly as Charlotte remembered, and beneath it a smaller packet tied with faded blue ribbon. Her hands went cold, then hot. For 2 years she had repeated the object details to herself in darkness, so memory would not be called hysteria. The brass corner caught winterlight and made memory physical. "Exhibit C," said the clerk softly, and wrote. Lady Agatha's composure cracked at the edges. "Any volume can be dressed to resemble," Mr. Pritchard cut across her with professional mildness. "Not with matched pagination, cross-indexing in your late husband's hand, and wax impressions carrying his private seal matrix. He lifted the ribboned packet, opened it, and withdrew a signet ring wrapped in linen gone yellow with age. Ivanov crest, stag and laurel. Charlotte felt her knees threaten and locked them hard. "Exhibit D," said the clerk. No one spoke for a full 3 breaths. In that quiet, Claire made the smallest sound, almost a sob swallowed back. She looked at Charlotte, then at her mother, and for the first time the hunger for spectacle was gone from her face. Only fear remained. Mr. Hales turned to her. "Lady Claire Ivanov, you are of age to testify. Did you ever see this ledger in your mother's possession?" Claire's fingers twisted in her skirts. Lady Agatha said, "You will not answer that," Mr. Hales replied. "She will answer the court." Claire shut her eyes once. "I saw it in the blue dressing closet in March," she whispered. "My mamma said it was old rent rubbish and that if I touched it she would cut off my allowance. I believed her." Imogen went rigid. "Claire!" Claire opened her eyes and spoke louder. "I also saw the signet in her jewel casket wrapped in a stocking. I thought it was broken and unsellable." Lady Agatha's face emptied of colour. The loaded glance she had thrown Charlotte for years, warning and promise together, found no purchase now. "Mr." Hales inclined his head to the clerk. "Record both statements." He turned to Lady Agatha. "Pending full accounting, your household books and personal ledgers are seized. You are removed from fiduciary control, effective now." The magistrate's 2 officers stepped in from the passage on that line, coats dark with mist, gloves ready. They moved to the escritoire, to the locked cabinet, to the keyring at Lady Agatha's waist. She resisted by habit, not force, and surrendered when Julian's presence at Charlotte's shoulder made calculation plain. Violet's silk rustled like a flag lowered against wind. "You disgrace this family," Lady Agatha said to Charlotte, voice low and venom clean. Charlotte met her eyes for the first time in years. "You did that yourself." By the 2nd hour after noon, the morning room had become a tribunal. Staff entered one by one. Grooms, housemaids, Mr. Finch with shaking hands and perfect memory. The maid from the carriage, who had once looked away, finally looked straight at Charlotte and confirmed under oath that Lady Agatha ordered her to deny food on travel days, so Charlotte would appear faint and dependent in public. The porter from the assembly rooms submitted his written note that Miss Ivanov was regularly sent through servants' entrances, despite family rank. Robert Vale, the blue-braided footman, testified to delivering Julian's message exactly as instructed, and seeing no impropriety in the arcade beyond emergency bandaging. Every strange piece found its place. Nothing was left floating. Julian did exactly what he had said. He stayed. Hour after hour. He stood beside Charlotte's chair while statements were taken and pages sanded and sealed. He did not sit. He did not leave to eat. When his wound pulled, she saw it only in the white line at the corner of his mouth. By the time the clerk marked the final deposition, 6 hours had passed, and the winter light at the windows had gone from pearl to slate. Mr. Hales capped his ink. Interim order is entered. Miss Ivanov's trust and properties are restored to her immediate control under temporary protective oversight until formal transfer at week's end. Lady Agatha Ivanov is to remove to Dower House at Eastmere by tomorrow sunset and is barred from financial contact with Ivanov accounts. Lady Agatha rose as if to object. Julian spoke first. "Record this as well. I will marry Miss Ivanov and her property is under my protection from this hour." The clerk's quill paused mid-air, then resumed, scratching the line into law. No one in the room moved. Not Mrs. Davies. Not Claire. Not the magistrate, who only asked, "Miss Ivanov, do you consent to this declaration?" Charlotte looked at Julian, not at his title, at his face carved by restraint and fatigue, and at the terrible steadiness with which he had chosen public consequence over private convenience. She understood the scale of it. So did everyone else. "I consent," she said. The formalities were exact. 3 days later, in the chapel at Harrow Vale, with rain on the leaded panes, Charlotte signed the settlement in her own hand, while Mr. Pritchard read each clause aloud. Her trust principle, tenant protections, independent disbursement authority retained in her name, no language of surrender hidden in the margins. Julian signed after her. His signature was blunt, military, final. Mrs. Davies stood witness on one side, Mr. Finch on the other, eyes wet and unashamed. When the documents were sealed, Julian held out his hand. Charlotte placed her father's restored signet in his palm. He closed his fingers around it, then opened them again and set it back into her hand. "It is yours," he said. At dusk that same day they crossed the threshold of Ivanov House together, not as supplicant and observer, as duke and wife, yes, but more than that, as witness and witnessed. Servants lined the hall, uncertain, hopeful, afraid to trust what they saw. Charlotte paused on the worn stone where she had stood with trays and account slips and hunger, then turned to Mrs. Davies. "Bread at proper hours for all staff," she said. "Medical care entered as household obligation, not favour. No lock on any coach house door may be dropped with a person inside, ever." Mrs. Davies's mouth trembled. "Yes, madam." Charlotte climbed the main stair, not the back one, and entered the room that had been her mother's, then stolen, then restored. In the attic she retrieved the hidden volume of poems from beneath the mattress, ticking, and carried it down herself, dust on her sleeves, heart steady. Nothing in the house was silent now in the old way. Floors creaked with ordinary work. Fires were lit before dark. Doors opened when she approached. Late, when the hall had emptied and rain softened against the windows, Julian found her in the library with the black ledger open under lamplight. He stood beside her chair and, in a voice meant for no one else, asked, "Does it hurt to be seen now?" Charlotte lifted her hand, laid the signet ring against his palm once more, and answered, less than being erased,